Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Jack Zenger, here with my colleague Joe Folkman, to talk with you about the tango of speed and quality. You've probably all heard the old saying that it takes two to tango. The tango is a very close, kind of precision, intimate dance that we thought was probably an apt description of this topic. Leadership speed, as we will talk about it from here on, is this interesting combination of an individual's pace and their ability to combine that with the quality, with getting things done right.
So let me take you back in history. Over a decade ago, Jack and I got together. We started to look at data that we'd use to help individuals develop. And that was the main purpose of the data, to give them insights about their strengths and weaknesses. But as we started to look at the data, we made a discovery, and the discovery was there was lots of insights there. Before that time, we, and actually most leadership theorists, had always kind of used an approach of sort of coming up with a theory and then going and trying to find data to prove the theory. Well, actually, most people didn't even try to find the data. They just kept saying, this sounds good, so it ought to be true, even if it isn't true. But what we started to do was look at the data and say, what is the data telling us? And in that process over the decades, we have looked at hundreds of thousands, really millions of pieces of data. One of the things that we've liked to do as we work with organizations is, as we get their senior management and some of their senior leaders in the organization, or even lower level managers, usually the question comes up, what do the most effective people do, and how are they different, and what behaviors really seem to help them to be successful? And several years ago, we did that study. We looked at the best leaders, we looked at average leaders, and then we said, what are the differentiating behaviors? And what we found is a series of behaviors, and as we looked at the top 20 items, we did a factor analysis, and that's where we cluster all these together. And what we found that emerged were three items. And the three items, one talked about spotting problems early. Another talked about quickly responding to problems. And a third one talked about quickly making needed changes. Now, it was interesting because as we looked at this, and as you look at that, and you said, well, what is that competency? That wasn't too hard to figure out. Quick, early. This was speed. And we said, gee, there appears to be a competency called speed. Now, at first, we sort of thought, well, that's interesting. This organization thinks speed is important. But we did the study again, and here it came again. And we did a study again, and it came again. And over time, we found that this competency reappears when we look at the most effective leaders as a capability of successful leaders. So we thought, gee, this is probably worthy of study. And so for the last couple of years, Jack and I have been looking at speed. Now, I always thought that we invented speed, but Jack tells me we probably didn't.
So in the year 2000, Jack Welch wrote one of his famous annual reports, and in that report he said he coined a mantra that would cover GE for many years, and that was speed, simplicity, and self-confidence. And he talked about the important power of speed, and he used kind of the example of that speed kind of scrapes the barnacles off the hull of the ship. And so he really was one of the first ones to kind of energetically talk about this. So we want to quickly point out we don't think this is a brand new idea that only we ever saw, but we think we've come to a point where we have some data about it.
Well, and what Jack really found there, Jack
Welch,
is that it had a dramatic effect on the fortunes of GE and on the success of that business. And, well, we think it's going to have a dramatic effect on many things too. As we think about speed, your initial idea is that this is all about how fast people work. But we've always found that it's the powerful combinations when it comes to leadership effectiveness that really create power. And early on, as we started to write about this, people really pushed us on saying, is this just about how fast people go? Or is it about how effective they are, how much they do the right kind of work? What is speed? And so we did this study where we looked at what we call powerful combinations. We looked at leaders who were good at doing things fast and leaders who were good at doing things right. And for good here, we're measuring people at the 75th percentile. And so we looked at people who were good at doing things fast, but not necessarily doing things right. So you're really fast, but not very quality oriented. And then we looked at the percentage of leaders who are at the 90th percentile, our best leaders in our database, and this is looking at 51,000 leaders. And we thought, what percent of leaders were really effective who were fast but not right? And we found a whopping 2%. Looks like that's not very powerful. And then we looked at leaders who were great at doing things right but not fast, right? And I always ask people, you think this is going to be higher or lower? And it seems like that's better, but that's only 3%. And so then we looked at the combination where people did both well. They were above the 75th percentile on both. They were both fast and right. You'd expect 5%, but you actually get 96%. And Jack, as we've looked at those powerful combinations, that's one of the strongest ones we've found, that combination of speed and quality, you know. And so the reality is, as we thought about it, nobody really feels like fast and wrong is ever fast. It's just that doesn't work. But what works is doing things fast and doing things right. So when we talk about speed, our definition's a little different.
Okay, so these two dimensions of doing things fast and doing things right, we think are not cut from the same bolt of cloth. And maybe a metaphor in the manufacturing realm would kind of help to illustrate that. If you're an automotive manufacturer and you're producing fenders or hoods or whatever, it's clear that the product needs to meet certain dimensions. It needs to be, the measurements and the contour of the metal need to be right. And it's also true that the surface can't have major blemishes that can't be effectively covered with a good coats of paint. But if you continue to kind of keep pushing quality and you go down from 1/100th of an inch to 1,000th of an inch in terms of your measurements, and if you polish the surface with the finest of abrasives, that doesn't add value to the product. So there's a standard that quality has to meet, but once having met that, that's sufficient. Speed, on the other hand, is a different thing. The more speed that an organization can produce, the more value it creates, so long as the quality standard continues to be met. And so these are, while they look like they're kind of in the same family of leadership characteristics, we think there are some very fundamental differences in the two. I'm reminded of years ago I was touring a large automobile manufacturing plant, and I was watching them change the dies that they use to do this metal stamping. And they talked about the fact that it hadn't been too long ago that it took them days to make the switch of one die to the next one. And then the Japanese came along and showed that it was possible to do it in a matter of hours. And then finally it got down to a matter of minutes. Clearly, the ability to make that change rapidly greatly enhanced the productivity of that plant, but only so long as the quality standard was being met. The dies had to be right, the outcomes had to be, the measurements had to be proper, and the surfaces needed to be of high quality. So we have coined this term leadership speed to describe that combination of doing things with a quick pace, but also doing things to a very high standard of quality.
And it's the combination of the two that creates this speed for us. Well, let's talk a little bit about, is there an impact for speed? We found it a differentiating competency, but does it create some positive outcomes in organizations? We are going to look at you personally, your team, and the organization. And so let's talk about you first as an individual. We did a study where we looked at people who had speed below the 75th percentile and those who were at the top quartile, 75th percentile or higher. And then we looked at overall leadership effectiveness, how you were rated as a leader. What we found is leaders who were below the 75th percentile, their average leadership effectiveness was the 40th percentile. But if you're in the top quartile on speed, you're at the 83rd percentile. So there's a 2x improvement for that speed. And there's other factors that go in there, but we were very impressed by the influence of speed in terms of how people perceived your effectiveness. We also looked at performance reviews, and we looked at people who had low speed ratings at the 10th percentile. They had about a 13% chance of being given and exceeds or far exceeds expectations. But if you were in the top 10%, there was a 74% chance of you being given that high rating. So we think that the speed a leader has a lot to do with their overall perceived effectiveness and the possibilities that they're going to be promoted and valued in the workplace. The second thing we started to think about was the effect on the team. How would you feel working for a leader who was speedy? Would this be a positive thing or a negative thing? Would you like it or would you hate it? And so we measured employee engagement and leadership speed, and we looked at leaders at the 1st to the 50th percentile on speed and found the engagement as the 41st percentile. Then we went to the 51st to the 75th. We found that engagement went up and to the 53rd percentile, and then we looked at the 76th through the 85th percentile. It went up again to the 61st, and then 86 to the 95th percentile, it went up again. So we saw this positive trend with speed, that the faster the speed, the higher the engagement. But then we got to the acid test. Would it continue to go up? And so we looked at leaders at the 96th percentile. It was up, 97th, up, 98th, up, 99th, up, 100th. There's no downside. The faster a leader worked, both with how fast they worked and the quality they produced, that speed factor drove engagement up. People love to work for speedy leaders. Isn't that interesting? And Jack, what conclusion do you draw from looking at that as you've had speedy leaders or slow ones?
I think that most of us enjoy being on winning teams, and the leader who moves at a brisk pace tends to be the fulcrum and the driving force for that organization to succeed. So I think there's no question that people tend to be more motivated when they're working on a team that's moving at a pace that doesn't sort of feel like it's just kind of dawdling along.
And think about how you feel when work is stalled or stopped. Think about how you feel when you're on a project that gets canceled. I mean, these are never positive experiences. The third thing we looked at was the organization. And the question was, would productivity go up with leadership speed? What we found is the percentage of highly committed employees increased as a leader's speed increased. And so this is what we call discretionary effort. That went up too. So the implications here are that speed helps you improve as an individual. It helps the engagement go up, so it helps the team improve, and it also helps the organization improve. It does those three very, very useful things for an organization. We have a scale that measures your focus on quantity or your focus on quality. So in our self-assessment, we provide a pace scale that measures your preference for fast or slow pace. We also measure quality or quantity orientation. It was interesting to look at that across different functions in an organization. What we found is that it is kind of situational. That if you looked at general management, sales, and marketing, they had a very strong quantity organization. It was like, get it out there, get it done, make it happen quickly. But if you look down at the other side of that graph there at safety and quality management, administrative, you can see that their preference was a little more towards quality. We also looked at this by geographies, and we found, and again, we're building our sample here, so we don't have absolutely definitive data yet, but we did find some interesting results when you looked across countries and this quality versus quantity orientation. Jack, does it surprise you that the Swiss move so fast?
We're on time.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? It is a country that's on time. And
that's right.
Jack might have a few relatives from there. But you see Belgium, Netherlands, France, Australia, Ireland, the United Kingdom, Singapore, China, Malaysia. So you have the Europeans and the Asians there, right? And then when you get down there to the end of that profile, you see Thailand, Philippines, Mexico, Indonesia, and Guatemala, where you know that orientation switches a little bit. Now, we're still gathering data. I need more results. This is based on data from 6,000 people across the globe. We need a lot more. But I did want to run this a little bit. This is funny. If you look at productivity data across countries, and this is just from general productivity data for the country as a whole, what you see is a pretty reasonable correlation between this focus on quantity versus quality and productivity data. So I find that, we still need to gather more data. This is early on, but that is an interesting outcome of this in terms of countries where there is an orientation towards we've got to move fast, we've got to get things done, versus countries where they're not as oriented that way and they're not sort of in as big a hurry, and you can see that graph there. The final thing is we looked at these data by position. So it's not a big surprise that if you look at top management, they tend to be focused on quantity, right? And if you looked at supervisors, there's still a focus on quantity, but not very strong. We ask a question of top managers and supervisors and middle managers. We said, if the organization were to move faster, would it help the organization to be successful? Now, the line there, the bars represent the quality-quantity orientation. The line there represents the percentage of positive responses on that question of the need for the organization to move faster. So as you see there, top management says we need to move faster, and there's 77%. Supervisors only 62%. It's not a huge difference, but it sort of lines up with that orientation a little bit in terms of having both those move along. So what we found in our data when we asked people if they felt like they're expected to move faster, 75% agree. When we asked them, too often I'm frustrated, our organization moves too slow, 60% agree. And when we asked them if this organization were to move faster, it would substantially influence our success, 67% agree. So again, this strong orientation around speed and kind of a stronger orientation on quantity than quality. But for some functions, quality is very, very important.
So the key takeaway from all of this is that speed of execution is indeed a competitive advantage. As the historian Stephen Kern observed, human beings have never opted for slower.
It's true.
So the question is, what can you do to deliberately increase your pace? Can you get things moving faster in the morning with taking a shower a little more rapidly, or putting on your makeup, or shaving? My wife laughs at me because in the morning I happen to have 2 electric razors, and I've done that for the last 50 years, I guess. It cuts my shaving time in half. And there are things you can do.
So that's how you got that book written so fast.
There are things you can do to help things get moving. At work, there are things you can do to increase the pace of conversations, to accelerate the meetings that you're involved in, to delegate some things that other people can do just as well and maybe quicker than you can, and avail yourself of all the latest technologies. I think that people really elect to walk at a very leisurely, kind of easygoing pace, or to walk a little more briskly. And pace is, to a large degree, within each of our, within the individual's control. So we hope that everybody listening to this webinar today can think of some specific steps that they can take that would help them to move at a more rapid, a brisk pace. Certainly one of the things that we know that goes on in most organizations is that the average person spends about 15% of their work week sitting in meetings. And we all kind of joke about meetings and how productive they are or they aren't. But it is obvious that if the leader who is in charge of that meeting prepares an agenda, says what's the purpose of this item, estimates the amount of time we're going to allocate to it, provides materials in advance, and he or she kind of keeps the group moving, that there's a lot that can be done to make what could be just a major drain on people's work week into something that's really far more productive.
I think, Jack, if we calculated the cost of people's time in a meeting, I mean, we get upset when we spend some money frivolously in an organization. But if you calculated the time and the cost of 15 minutes of extra time in a meeting, I mean, it would blow us all away because it's really expensive.
I heard about some company that had on the wall a little meter that was clicking away in terms of the estimated cost per hour of all the people who were in the room. And it did get people's attention when they began to think about what is this meeting really costing us. Yeah. There's an interesting concept that has been expressed by 2 very different people. One of them is pictured here on the slide that you're saying. She is Mary Kay Ash, the founder of Mary Kay's Cosmetics. And she made the comment that the speed of the leader determines the speed of the team. What's fascinating is that Lee Iacocca of automotive fame made exactly that same comment in exactly those same words. So who deserves the credit for it, I don't know, but it is true that the speed of the leader does set the pace for what happens with the entire team. And I think there's a kind of a great story told about Jeffrey Immelt, who's the chairman of General Electric. Not long after being appointed to that position, he was talking to a group of GE leaders, And he was making the point that he believed everybody in the room, regardless of position, regardless of tenure in the organization, needed to have a personal plan of development to which they were, committed and they were working. And some courageous person in the back of the room kind of raised his hand and said, "So, what's yours?" And Immelt, without hesitation, kind of said, I agonize over decisions. I make decisions too slowly. And I need to work on accelerating the pace with which I make important decisions. So we think that there's ways that people can deliberately work on their own personal pace. And certainly if they can think about what a leverage position they have when they're the leader of a function or a team, that it is their speed that sets the speed of the team.
Well, Jack and I were thinking about this concept of speed and quality and the difficulty of it. We have found in our data that it's very clear that as people have more of a quality orientation, their speed reduces in general. So we did a HBR article on this, the traits of leaders who do things fast and well. And what we looked at were leaders who had a quality orientation and a slow pace, and leaders who had a quality orientation and a fast pace. And we found 50% of the people that you could have a quality orientation and a fast pace, that was possible, but we then started to delve into the data and saying, what did they do? What did those leaders with a quality orientation and a fast pace do that those who had a quality orientation and a slow pace? Because again, the issue for us is how do you get things right and fast, that combination there. Well, we looked at the data, and what we discovered is that there were 7 factors that had a dramatic influence on both quality and pace. And that leaders that were able to use these levers, we call them companion behaviors, but what they are, they were levers. And when you use these levers, it helped you with both quality and with pace. And that is the golden combination there that we'd like to achieve. So we want to talk about these, and what we'd like to ask you to do is, as you think about these levers as a kind of a personal development opportunity here this year, ask yourself the question, are there a couple of these that I could use to help me increase my pace but also increase the speed? And so the first one we're going to talk about is strategic perspective.
Clear strategic perspective. So as it's been observed, it's not possible to drive fast enough to make up for being on the wrong road or having missed an important turn. That knowing where you're going and being able to articulate that clearly to the people that are around you is kind of this first of these companion behaviors that seems to be so powerful in helping people achieve that great balance of high, speed and quality.
So strategic perspective is one way to increase your speed. Another way is setting stretch goals and high standards. Now, we have for a long time been great proponents of stretch goals. Our data is so clear that leaders who set stretch goals get higher levels of performance and that get their team to accept it, that this is a wonderful technique of increasing the pace. But then you have this case of Samsung with the Galaxy 7. Again, the story is that Samsung was really looking at the release of the new iPhone and trying hard to beat that product with the release of their product, okay? And so they had a stretch goal. Let's beat Apple. That was good. but what they didn't have is high standards. And so what you end up is a phone that gets released early, but it blows up. That's a kind of a problem. Most of us have been on an airplane when they announce, if you have a Samsung Galaxy, you need to take that off the plane. Have discovered that is a really dangerous product. And again, what they did is they got stretch goals, but they didn't have the high standards. When you put those together and you enforce both of those continuously, you do get quality and speed together. And so you got to do the both together. The next one is about communicating powerfully. We all know what happens when communications get messed up. I heard this story the other day of a woman who sends a text message to her partner, and the text message was a picture of her in a dress with the message, "Does this dress make me look fat?" Now, I don't know if you ever got a message like this, but her partner replied with a very strong no, N-O-O-O, and then autocorrect came along and changed it to M-O-O-O. So it's interesting, got him in a little bit of trouble there, that miscommunication. Most of us don't communicate often enough. We don't let people know what's going on, when it's happening, what the expectations are. We assume we do, but we don't. And what Jack and I have found as we've looked at pre-post data is this is the most malleable competency, that this competency gets greater levels of improvement than any other competency. So it's a critical competency. It's fairly easy to improve your effectiveness on it. You just need to pay attention to it and develop some new habits and better skills and work on it. But doing that, communicating well, will increase quality because people know what they're supposed to do and when they're supposed to do it, and it increases speed.
The fourth of these companion behaviors is the courage to make change. Courage takes many different forms. It takes courage to admit that you're wrong. It takes courage to apologize to someone for something that you've said or done. It takes a lot of courage to kind of ask for feedback. It takes courage to kind of raise your hand in a group meeting and differ from what seems to be the prevailing point of view of the group or the prevailing point of view of the person who's the senior leader of the team. All of these involve taking risks. It takes courage to try something new. Takes courage to support an unpopular position. In our work, we do a lot of 360-degree feedback. I'm always amazed at the courage that it takes for an executive to initiate the whole 360-degree feedback process for his or her group. These all require courage, but it is that willingness to take this combination of risk and willingness to face the truth that seems to be very instrumental in helping people move more rapidly.
Another way to increase both quality and speed is this external perspective. Several years ago, a couple of decades ago, I was with a group. We had felt like we had done an amazing job of creating a great firm and growing that firm. And we were so proud of what we did. And then somebody said, well, how do we compare with others? When we looked at the data of how other firms had grown in that same period of time, we didn't look great at all. And then we said, well, if you looked at the economy in general, what was the growth? And even compared to that, we didn't do well. It's so easy to get so caught up in what you're doing and your stuff and your organization that you lose sight of the external world and what's going on outside of you. Typically, when I do that, I get a realization of my real pace. And again, if you want to increase your pace, focus on what others are doing, what your competitors are doing, what customers are doing, and what people in general are doing. And oftentimes that will help you increase your pace.
The sixth of these companion behaviors we've labeled inspires and motivates others. There are many different approaches that people use to being inspiring. The good news is that if you are committed to providing a greater sense of purpose and motivation and enthusiasm, there isn't just one way of doing it. People do it by being very enthusiastic, by being a real cheerleader for what the organization is doing. Some people do it by being extremely capable of painting an exciting vision of what can happen in the future. Other people do it by being just very personable, building great relationships with their colleagues inside, involving them, showing great respect for them. Still others are inspiring because they are very technically competent, and they bring to the table a level of technical expertise that's unparalleled by their colleagues. Others are really great at being drivers. They feel the need for getting things done. So being inspiring and motivating is important, and the good news is there's lots of ways of doing it.
There really is, and that's one of the characteristics, again, that makes a leader good at quality and speed. The last one that we found was this fostering innovation. I remember several years ago I was building a heat chart. So let me explain a heat chart. In this particular heat chart, we had 100 cases that we were looking at, and what we were trying to do was look at the data, and based on the data, we would assign a color, and we had 5 levels of color in there. And so I was looking at a spreadsheet with 100, and there were 17 columns, and I was doing this by hand. And I noticed, there were clear cut points in the data, but I kept making mistakes, and it was moving very slow. And I'm thinking, I have better things to do with my life. It is a great way to look at data, but it's so hard to complete. And so I went to see Lynn. Lynn is one of our programmers here. He's a genius in terms of programming. And I said, Lynn, I know this is an impossible task, that this would probably take weeks or years to complete. But can you automate this process some way? And Lynn says, well, I can write a macro. Well, he said you could write a macro. And I go, no, I can't. But he could write a macro. It took him 15 minutes to write a macro that completed that heat chart with no errors in about 5 seconds. When you executed the macro. And since he's written that, he wrote that about, maybe 5 years ago, I've used that over and over again to create heat charts. Now, there is always a better way. There's always an innovative way to increase both quality and speed. And again, so often we just drudge through stuff. We just push harder. We don't look at that innovative way to approach it. And if we did, it would help us to, again, be faster and do things right. So what we have are these 7 companion behaviors. Choose a couple of those to help you increase your speed and quality. We think that this can help you on this particular dimension of speed. Now, what's interesting when we looked at this research is we found that 6 of the 7 here were actually dimensions we found for just speed alone. And so we actually believe that our approach to increasing speed will help you with increasing quality. As I've looked at situations here, recently we've talked about hidden talent in organizations. The analogy we've used is, several years ago in the U.S., we thought that we didn't have enough oil. Well, we've discovered we have plenty of oil. We just didn't know how to access it. And all of my clients say, we don't have enough talent. Well, you do. You're really good at using talent, but not very good at developing talent. I think that every organization I work with take some time during the year to get people together, to have a meeting, to kind of rally them around the strategy and set some goals and follow up with people. I'd like to challenge all our clients that as they get together, think about taking some time for development. Now, here's our data. When we sit down and ask leaders, how many of you have an action plan you're currently working on? We find only about 10% of people have an action plan they're currently working on. So you've got talent, but they're not growing. You're not growing the talent and developing the talent. At that meeting that you have during the year, we have a great suggestion about what you could do. We've created a very quick 90 to 120-minute workshop around leadership speed. We believe that this workshop can help people to get a self-assessment of their pace, and that by the end of the workshop, they'll have a development plan about what they could do to increase their individual speed. Think about what would happen in your organization if you were able to increase your speed. Wouldn't that be a positive effect? Now, we'd love to tell you more about this workshop, about this whole leadership speed topic. We have a book that we've written on it, and you can get a hold of that book. And if you'd like to talk to us about this workshop, how it might fit into some of the opportunities you have where you're getting people together, our leaders for several years have always said to me, we want to do development, we just don't have enough time. We can't give you a day. And so when we wrote this book on leadership speed, we thought, we got to do this fast. We found a way to do this in about 120 minutes or even 90 minutes. So if you're interested in this, please let us know, and we'd love to tell you more about leadership speed. Thanks so much for attending our webinar today. Good luck on being both fast and right.